But I'm very happy to be here, and I'm pleased to see so many people here to talk about the real history of the Iraq War. Because now that it is perceived that for the most part the Iraq War as we knew it from 2003 up until just recently has largely ended. The large numbers of troops, the occupying troops, have gone. And of course with that, the US government is going to try to write the history of the war as they want it to be written. And that started not too long ago, actually. It actually started on the 9th anniversary of the war, the day that the invasion began, March 19th. President Obama made the day an official holiday to mark the anniversary. That day, March 19th, is now called the National Day of Honor. President Obama wrote in his declaration that soldiers fought block by block to help the Iraqi people seize a chance for a better future, that the soldiers took new roles as diplomats and development experts to improve the communities where they served, that their strength toppled a tyrant and their valor helped build opportunity in oppression's place. Across the nearly 9 years of conflict, the glory of their service always shone through, he said. The language in this declaration is just gushing over the honor and heroism of US service members and the righteousness of the mission. The bravery, the valor, the glory, the sacrifice, the success. This is how they are writing the history of the war. A just, heroic mission with an unforeseen, evil resistance that was defeated only by our soldiers' determination to serve the United States of America. That's the history that they want to write. And they want to write the history that way because the reality is very different. The reality is that this government sent those soldiers that they are honoring with this holiday, sent them to a war against the will of the majority of people, both in the United States and in Iraq, that they lied, and we can say now with no question that they lied about why they were sending those soldiers, that they ordered them to unleash the full might of the most powerful military machine in history against a people that had committed no crime nor posed any threat to our friends or family, that they gutted our schools, our communities, our healthcare, our social services to pay for the war, that they laid waste to a beautiful, proud country, and when the war wasn't going well, or was going as they planned, they kept throwing bodies and more bodies and more bodies into the grinder. And in its wake, they left every single person who was touched by that war destroyed and abandoned with no help, while the vultures on Wall Street cashed in. This is the real history of the Iraq War. And what will, for the time being anyway, be etched into the calendars in the United States as a National Day of Honor, we know that it will be something very different for Iraq. It will be the day that they'll remember as a day of fear, as a day of pain, as a day that began a new nightmare, one that would take the lives of over 1.3 million people, that would leave 5 million homeless, 4 million orphaned, a day when a foreign military invaded their soil in a war of aggression and would not leave, and remained there for years to raid their homes, torture their parents and children, shred their identity, and patrol their streets. That day, March 19th, 2003, will forever be ingrained into the consciousness of the Iraqi people. Not as a day to honor the US military, but as a day that they saw its true face. I was one of those soldiers who marched into Iraq on the eve of the invasion in March of '03. I was 19 years old. I wanted to go. I was willing to die for my country, or whatever that means, as President Obama has just honored us for. But I didn't know a lot of things then. I didn't know that when our commander-in-chief, my top military commanders and civilian advisors, that when they were telling us why we had to risk our lives, that they were lying, and they knew they were lying. I didn't know that they lied because they couldn't tell the truth, because the truth was so sinister. On the eve of the invasion, I didn't know that we would not be greeted with flowers and people cheering in the streets, because I didn't know that for more than 10 years prior, innocent people had already been dying at the hands of the United States government. As we saw how they spent years bombing the food supplies, the water treatment plants, civilian infrastructure, hospitals, that they intentionally starved Iraq, that they intentionally denied medicine, so that hundreds of thousands of children would die as a result, that this was the calculated strategy. This is the government we're dealing with. I didn't know that I'd be a part of such an unparalleled loss of innocent life, such an unmatched level of destruction, that it would constitute the greatest atrocity of the modern era. That is the real history of the Iraq War. And they want the history of the Iraq War to be that the relationship between U.S. forces and the Iraqi people was one of mutual respect and cooperation with some rogue extremist elements and al-Qaeda operatives and foreign agents making trouble because they hated freedom or something. But life under occupation tells a different story. From day one of the war, the rules of engagement were such that you could essentially kill anyone you wanted and get away with it, and it would be okay. And in a military inundated and indoctrinated with racism and chauvinism, that if soldiers or private mercenaries wanted to make Iraq their shooting range, they could do it. But it was beyond an environment that allowed forces to run wild. It was a matter of policy. I remember soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division, who I ended up being attached to an armored division that rolled into Tikrit, talking about how when they rolled into the city with tanks and armored vehicles, they rolled in just shooting in all directions. Shooting tank guns, shooting heavy machine guns, just in all directions to let the Iraqi people know that we were there and that they shouldn't mess with them. Soldiers and Marines who've been to Iraq will tell you that some were ordered to shoot anybody carrying a shovel in a country that has a lot of farmers because most of their infrastructure had been destroyed. Anyone carrying a shovel should be shot because maybe they were using it to dig an IED. That anyone carrying a cell phone should be shot. These were rules of engagement. Some will tell you of a rule known as 360-degree fire, which means anytime a bomb goes off or an IED goes off, the standard operating procedure, the orders, are to shoot in 360 degrees in all directions, even in civilian areas where civilians will no doubtedly be killed. This is part of the strategy that some soldiers and Marines will tell you they were ordered to out-terrorize the terrorists. I saw artillery barrages fired seemingly at random in response to small mortar fire, and thinking, if we're in a country that's just a civilian population, where some of the civilian population is fighting back, that it's not this army, there's not some enemy bases, who can we be shooting artillery at? Where are they landing? And then I would see the results, because families would come to us whose children had been killed, whose children's limbs had been blown off, who came to us begging for some kind of monetary compensation because they were left with absolutely nothing. I saw literally thousands of detainees who did absolutely nothing except be a military-age male who just happened to live in a village that was picked at random to be raided one night, and then was brought into detention facilities to be tortured and humiliated. For me personally, as I said earlier, I wanted to go to this war. I believed very much in it. I believed very much in the military, in our country. But all of the lies and indoctrination that we were being fed couldn't mask the reality because I had other teachers beyond the president and the military commanders. And those are the Iraqi people. And there are several people who will always be burned into my memory that are the ones that taught me the truth and taught me which side I was on. It was men who were urinating themselves and bleeding through sandbags on their heads in detention facilities. It was a father who was shot through the neck, and as he was dying, saying over and over, I just want to see my family. I just want to see my family. And the number one person, the one that really did it for me, was I have a little sister who's now 18, so she was 8 about at the time I deployed. I got her name tattooed on my arm before I left. Her name's Rachel. And we were ordered at this one point to kick these families out of their homes for whatever reason. And there is this 8-year-old girl who looked exactly like my sister. And it was my job to drag her out of her house as she was crying, as her parents were crying, as her siblings were crying, arrest the males in her family, put them on a truck and send them to those detention facilities. And I couldn't stop looking at her face because it was my sister's face. And I realized, that this girl was exactly like my sister. That man who was shot was exactly like my father. And that these people were just like my family. And then so what happened was, I couldn't stop seeing that everything that we were doing to the Iraqi people, I was doing to my own family. Because they are our family. They're our brothers and sisters. And so this was the breaking point for myself and for so many others. And the daily violence, the daily abuse, the daily humiliation, all by an unwanted foreign invader, led to a widespread popular uprising against the occupation. And no rank-and-file soldier who has been to Iraq can say that they don't understand why the Iraqi people stood up and fought back. In fact, that's the main factor why the majority of US troops ended up opposing the war, because it was clear that the resistance of the Iraqi people was justified. But the US government had a plan for the popular rebellion too. They used the tactics of divide and conquer and shredded a once united country. And in its wake, they left the country completely destroyed. And it's difficult to overstate the level of suffering and destruction that the Iraqi people now deal with. And anyone believing the lie that the war in Iraq was somehow out of care for the Iraqi people, one just has to look to the wake of the war within the US military to see how true that is. To see how much this government cares about its own soldiers, let alone Iraqis. Today, in the wake of the Iraq war, there's an epidemic of suicides in the US military. Where for the past 3 years, more active duty soldiers are killing themselves than are being killed in combat. This is a staggering, shocking number. Thousands already have been abandoned and left to die alone with the guilt and trauma of what they had been sent to do. Hundreds of thousands of families thrown into chaos by loved ones they no longer recognized. Suicides and suicide attempts are at such a staggering, record-breaking rate that you can only call it an emergency situation. You can only call it a crisis that this government has refused to respond to in any meaningful way. I've traveled to different bases that have high rates of suicide. And the numbers are staggering. Really, among veterans, there's 950 suicide attempts a month. But when you see these people's faces, I met people who jumped out of their window in the middle of the night because they heard voices speaking in Arabic every time they turned the lights off. I've met people who can't eat because they can't hold their utensils because they shake so bad. And these same people, when they go to the doctors in the army and say, I need help, they're told that they're fine and they have to go on other deployments. And they can go 1,000,000 times a day to every doctor, every chaplain, every leader that they have in their chain of command, and they'll be told the same thing. It will always be written into the history of this war that during this time, the US government allowed a wave of preventable suicides. It threw its US military and did absolutely nothing to stop it. But not only did nothing to stop it, but actively tried to deny soldiers their access to treatment, to deny them compensation. This is what they're doing now, as they say, to save precious tax dollars. The same people who spared no expense writing blank checks for new weapon systems. And of course, if we can witness the truly shocking, devastating effects of the war on US troops, one can only imagine the level of psychological trauma experienced by Iraq's entire population, who didn't do just one tour or 2 tours, but lived 20 years under constant bombing and 9 years of brutal occupation. None will bear the scars of the war deeper than the Iraqi people. But this history is still being written. Iraq is a country of proud, strong, heroic people. Iraq will rise from the ashes, and the US policy of denying Iraq any independence from the grip of Wall Street will remain firmly in place. So there's another chapter in this story. But what we want to do today is not just tell the real history of the Iraq War, but present a way that we can truly commemorate and honor the millions of Iraqis whose lives were destroyed, the thousands of US troops whose lives were thrown away. To do that, we must let the real history of the Iraq War become a tool to expose the system. We must let its lessons be a guide to fight the system. We must let its horror stories be a catalyst of resistance to the system. We must link the suffering and hardship of the Iraqi people at the hands of the US government to the suffering and hardship of our friends and family at the hands of the US government, to show that their struggle is our struggle and that we have a common enemy and that we have common interests. We must let the real history of the Iraq War destroy the great lie that there is such a thing as American interests, that there is such a thing as one nation. Because the Iraq War exposes that there are 2 distinct sets of interests in this country that are diametrically opposed to one another. The interests of the banks, of Wall Street, of the 1%, and the interests of the majority, of those who spend their lives working hard to feed their families, those who want to go to school, those who want to live in peace, the 99% of us. Our interests are nowhere close to the interests of those who sent us to war, and they are absolutely in line with the interests of the 99% abroad. So let's let the real history of the Iraq War and its lessons fuel our anger, our determination, our resolve to winning justice for the war's victims, punishing the criminals who sent us there, thwarting their plans for empire elsewhere in the region, and knocking down this entire criminal system altogether. Wow.